Hey everybody, welcome back. I am really excited today because I just picked up a piece of gear I have not owned in over 30 years. I first got one of these in 1986 when I was a teenager, and a couple years later, I was young, I needed cash, so I sold it, and I've thought about it ever since, and the opportunity was in front of me recently, so I jumped on it, and I'm really excited. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about a Rockman, in particular a Rockman X100. And in this video, I'll talk a little bit about the history behind the Rockman, and I'll play a little bit for you. For people like me that grew up with them, had one years back, when you plug it in, it just brings back so many great memories. And the tone is, while not perfect, is definitely fun to play with. All right, let's jump on into it.
Now, the Rockman was introduced in 1982 and was developed by MIT grad and former Polaroid senior design engineer Tom Schultz. Oh, and Tom also just happened to be the lead guitar player for the hugely successful rock band Boston. Now, Boston's debut album, 6 years earlier, was kind of groundbreaking in a few ways, including a very lush-sounding rock production for that time, which amazingly was all done in Schultz's basement for the cost of around $2,000. Now that was 6 years before the Rockman went public, and no, a prototype of the Rockman was not used on that album either, but the Rockman was not the first product Schultz developed. That would be a power attenuator called the Power Soak, but the Rockman was the big hit for his company Schultz R&D. The Rockman was originally marketed heavily as a portable headphone amp, and the name Rockman was a play on the hugely successful portable cassette tape player Sony's Walkman, which debuted in 1979. Now, if you were alive in the 80s, there's a good chance you owned a Walkman or an imitation of it. Anyway, the Rockman wasn't just used as a portable headphone amp for a guitar. It was intended for several applications, and it would be used both live and, more importantly, in the studio, and really can be looked at as the first mass-produced amp simulator. It can be heard on many popular recordings in the 80s, including but not limited to recordings by Joe Satriani, Megadeth, and perhaps most notably Def Leppard. And of course, there's no denying that those first two Boston albums that came out before the Rockman definitely inspired the tone of it. And that first Boston album from 1976, it really was ahead of its time from a guitar tone standpoint. And in my opinion, I believe that prior to Van Halen's debut album 2 years later, that first Boston album was probably the most important step forward in guitar tones and production since the beginning of the 70s, right, with Zeppelin and those other bands. Even though Van Halen is often credited as really defining the guitar sound of the 80s, I believe Tom Schultz was equally as important. And as some of you guys know, I'm a huge Van Halen fan, so I don't say that lightly. Now, after the original Rockman, they released the ultralight version in 1983, and then discontinued both in '84 when they released the X100, the Soloist, and the Bass Rockmans. The X100 really was the replacement for the original Rockman, and it became the flagship Rockman moving forward. Now, around 1990, they also started producing the economical Rockman Ace products, which are still in development today, but by Dunlop, whom Schultz sold the rights to in the mid-90s. Now, I haven't tried any of the Ace products, but from what I hear, they just don't compete with the stuff from the 80s. But the Ace products are inexpensive. They sell for around 80 to 90 bucks. Whereas these X100s used today can typically be found for a few $100 on Reverb or eBay. Now sometimes you can find a Rockman that's all original, components, and sometimes like this one, they've been refurbished with new capacitors, which I highly recommend. And I think there are quite a few people that do the refurbishments out there. I've seen them run for like 100 to 150 bucks or so. So if you find one that needs work, keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk more about the tones and sounds that the Rockman X100 is capable of producing. There are 4 tones I'm going to run you through. Clean 2, Clean 1, Edge, and Distortion. Now, one big limitation of the device is that we have no tone shaping EQ controls. No bass, middle, treble, presence, right? You can adjust the overall gain, plus or minus 8 decibels, via a little control on the back. And for my audio examples, I keep it in the default setting. I've just found that when you crank up the gain through that little knob on the back, you kind of lose some of that top end that is, an important characteristic of the Rockman. So I tend to leave it flat, and if I need a little more gain, I'll put like an overdrive in front. That's what I used to do back in the day, and you'll hear that in a minute on some lead stuff. Now, for effects, we have chorus and echo. Now, you can't turn both the chorus and echo off. You can only turn one off at a time. Yeah, I know that sounds kind of weird, but basically your options are 1, keep both the chorus and the echo on, 2, just the chorus, or 3, just the echo. Again, you can't turn both off. Now, fortunately, the chorus is a relatively moderate chorus in my opinion, so leaving it on all the time is not a bad thing for me. Here's a little with and without the chorus. Now the echo is a very fast, kind of slap back with multiple repeats. Now listen carefully here as I play a single little chord here, and listen to how it echoes. And that's really not my ideal type of echo. When I use a delay pedal, for example, I tend to do, 1 repeat for rhythm, and then maybe, up to 3 for lead, somewhere a little less than 400 milliseconds, right? So this is not really the style of echo that I would typically use, but once you blend it in with other instruments, etc., it sounds pretty good, albeit a little quiet. So the Rockman was definitely limited in terms of the tone and effect shaping capabilities, but fortunately the stock sounds are pretty nice. Again, it's not going to compete with some of the the amp modelers today, but for the time it was really cool, and like I said, it's really fun to go back and rediscover these tones. Now, eventually Schultz would produce his rack-mountable rock modules, debuting in 1986, which would allow guitar players the flexibility that we all really crave. But those were not cheap, and the Rockman remained a popular way of getting the Schultz sound in a relatively economical way. Now, you also have an additional auxiliary input which could be used for connecting to like a home stereo, for example, if you wanted to like play along with incoming music. And then we've got 2 outputs that were used for either headphones or sending the signal to a mixer, etc. Now, you can also use that auxiliary input as a low-level output and send your signal to the front of an amp, but the tone gets a little bit degraded going that route. That said, I used to occasionally use my Rockman back in the 80s as a form of preamp, and I found that just by adjusting the amp's high end appropriately, you could still get some pretty cool tones that way. Now, for the purpose of the audio samples you're hearing here, I'm running right into the microphone input of my PC, right? Because it's a 3.5 millimeter jack on the Rockman. So I'm using a 3.5 millimeter male to male cable going into my computer. So it's very basic, and it doesn't really capture perfectly the sound with headphones that you get with the Rockman, but you can adjust the EQ when you're kind of mixing things and kind of make up for that if you feel like you need to. Anyway, let's start with some clean tones, and I'm going to alternate between the clean 2 and the clean 1 channels here. Clean 2 is a more of a full-bodied clean tone, and clean 1's a lot more compressed and tight, so you get to hear them kind of back to back. Okay, next we're going to do the edge setting. This is kind of like a low level crunch type tone. I don't use it very much. I tend to use a little bit more gain than this, but occasionally it's fun. Here's some of those tones. And then finally, we have the distortion channel. This is the high gain channel. And really, I think it's more moderate gain, to be honest, compared to, high gain rigs these days. And as I said, you can adjust the gain on the back of the device, but I prefer to leave it in the default setting because once you start cranking it, I find it just kind of loses some of that top end and gets maybe a little bit too woofy, for lack of better terms. So when I want a little bit extra gain for leads, I'll just kick in an overdrive pedal. I'll stick an overdrive pedal in front of the unit. And what I'm doing here with these examples, I'm going to play it with and without the overdrive. And actually what it is, it's a TC Electronic spark boost pedal.
All right, everybody, that was my video on the Rockman X100. I'm so excited to have one of these again. I know that, again, it's kind of a novelty, but for people of my generation, it just brings back so many great memories, and they're a lot of fun to play with. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and please subscribe if you aren't already. And if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below, and I will answer all as time allows. Until next time, Rockman on.